Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the welcome. Thanks for the invitation. And I want to be doing all things we can do to lift up our prayers and step up and defend people that are persecuted around this world. And for me, I'm still sitting here thinking, what's the best way to start this? We're more than 2,000 years of history here, and how did we get to this place that we don't understand? And people ask for peace in Israel, but we haven't unraveled that onion that has layer after layer of that goes all over the Middle East. And so I kind of came to a place where I think it'd be good for us to back up to a place. It'd be nice to have the time to go back up to the birth of Christ and talk about him walking throughout the Holy Land, which, by the way, when I studied that as a younger man, I never had a map in front of me. And so the distances were different in my mind than they were when I finally got to Israel, and I could see the sign that said a few miles over to Damascus, you can stand in Jerusalem and see Bethlehem. All that geography that was so different in reality than it seemed to be in my imagination. But some things that I think are just really important for us to understand. And for that I can think of the number of encounters. But one of them was about three students that were young men that were college age that came to visit me in my office in Washington, and they were all Muslim young men. And one of them I remember was from Chad. The other two I don't remember for sure which country they were from, but as soon as I brought up Israel, they just went livid. And I saw this deep and abiding hatred in them. And so I rolled out a map and I said, look at all of this. North Africa, all over the Middle East, these are places where Muslims live. And you've got this tiny little place called Israel. And this is their home. No, they can't live there. Well, tell me, where can they live? Not there. Tell me some place where Jews can live. Not there. Why do you hate them? They can't live there. It was livid within them. It was so deep, and I couldn't understand it. And I don't know that I understand it yet, but I went back and started to look back through the history. And so Muhammad was, his last breath on earth was about 632 A.D. He started his dictation that turned into the Quran about 20 years earlier, so say around 612. And then as this unfolded, if you read through the Quran, and I'm not a scholar of it, but I listen to people who are, and they say that, well, I know that the component within it is this: there is the abrogated and the abrogating. And so the words that Muhammad said later in life often contradict the things that he said earlier in life. Well, how could it be a holy book that's written with perfection if it's full of contradictions? Well, the Islamic scholars, the Quranic scholars, came up with a solution for that. They said the things that Muhammad said later in life supersede the things that he said earlier in life. And so when you got to understand it chronologically, and anything that he didn't contradict stands, but the things he contradicted, the most recent contradiction is what stands. They don't say it like that, but that's what it is. And so when you read through there, you see that in Mecca, where this originated for them, they had, Muhammad said good things about Jews. Mecca was made up then, at that time around 610, 612 or so, made up about a third Christians, about a third pagans, and about a third Jews. And so he spoke well enough of the Jews back during the time when he was in Mecca, but when he ran out of welcome in Mecca and they went to Medina, there were 3 Jewish tribes there. And he isolated the weakest of the 3 tribes. He got crossways with them. He was sitting in judgment of them, being paid like a judge to do that. And so as he got more and more frustrated and found more and more conflicts with the 3 Jewish tribes, he isolated the smallest of the 3 Jewish tribes, marginalized them, surrounded them, and finally they surrendered, and he let them give up all of their goods and all of their possessions and walk off across the desert to see if they could survive. Now, I don't know if history records whether they did or whether they didn't. I don't know the answer to that. I know they were gone. And so over a period of time, he still had trouble with the Jews, and he began to say more and more things that were more critical of the Jews. And so then the second least powerful tribe, he was working his way up. He isolated them, surrounded them, and then let them surrender, took all of their goods, and marched them out onto the desert to survive or not, and behold at their own wits and instincts. And then there remained the strongest Jewish tribe that was there. He had major conflicts with them. And over a period of time, he decided that he would mount an operation against them, and it was military. And so he went in with his armed forces and surrounded the third Jewish tribe. And over a siege that lasted, by my reading of history, about 25 days, they decided, we don't have enough food, we don't have enough water, we're going to have to either surrender or die. And so they decided that Muhammad would turn them loose and let them go out across the desert if they would just give up all of their weapons and all of their possessions. And so they surrendered and gave up all their weapons and all their possessions. But this time, Muhammad took control of them, and he marched the men over the hill out of sight, and in groups of around 8, he lined them up and gave the order, or actually he gave the authority to one of his subordinates. He knew what the order was going to be, to execute them. And so the military-aged men, in numbers that history reads between 600 and 900, were executed there at Medina, and that was the end of the third Jewish tribe there. Now, that level of hatred is something that they know about within their history, and they bring that against Jews. That's still that level of hatred that I heard and saw in the eyes and heard in the voice of those 3 students, the one from Chad, that hatred that you see that motivates people in places like Israel now. That 13 attacks today, to most of them, take out a knife and attacked an innocent civilian that's not expecting this in any way, one of them an American, as you told me, Daniel. And so how can this kind of hatred be transferred over all of these centuries? And I don't know if I know the answer to this, but after Muhammad died in 632 AD, then they set about, his troops and his minions set about to conquer the known world. And in that period of time, the next 100 years, they conquered most of what was the known world at that time. And by 732, 100 years later, they found themselves up against Charles Martel in France. 732 was the Battle of Tours, when the Christian forces rose up against the Islamic forces in Tours, and there Charles Martel, King Charles, didn't have a cavalry to match up against the cavalry that he was faced with, but he posted his infantry in the trees with pikes, and they were attacked by the cavalry. And riding a horse through trees, you ever try that? It doesn't work so good. It didn't work so good either for the Islamists at the time, and they were routed there on the plains of Tours and chased back to the east, and their bones were left out there there for as long as it took for nature to decompose those bones. That's how far back this hatred and this fight goes, and they've always been a conquering people. And so that's 732. Let me fast forward to dates that also matter. 1683. The Muslims had, again, they'd surrounded the city of Vienna. They'd conquered most of the known world at the time, and they were pushing back into Europe, pushing in to crush Western civilization, Western Christendom, as Winston Churchill described it. They had surrounded Vienna. They had Vienna under a siege from about July 25th on up until into September. And it was a reluctant thing for the Christians to band together and decide that they were going to take on this huge Muslim army, that if Vienna would have collapsed and fallen to them, all of Western Europe would have fallen to the armies that were roughly 450,000 troops surrounding that city, digging under the walls, setting black powder charges on there, detonating those charges, digging the loose soil and the rubble out, fighting skirmishes around there that went on. They didn't think that Vienna could last more than 2 or 3 days at the most, when, who would think that to the rescue came the Polish King Jan Sobieski, who brought his cavalry in and matched up with the infantry of 3 German kings. And there at a church called the Kahlenberg Church on a hill overlooking Vienna, on that night of September 11th, 1683, they held a Christian service in the ruins of that church. And there they prayed that God would deliver them a victory against the Islamist hordes that were ready to tear down the gates of Vienna the next morning. And as the sun arose, one of the German kings ordered an all-out charge by his infantry, and that started the whole thing. And in a matter of a day, there was a rout. And again, there was a great, glorious victory that had been prayed for the night before at the Kahlenberg Church, right there overlooking the city of Vienna. It is a glorious place to be and stand and pray. And there, in 1983, 300 years to the day, King Jan Sobieski's victory there was translated 300 years later by Pope John Paul II, who celebrated a Mass on that very location. And I've had the privilege of praying from that kneeler in that Kahlenberg Church, which is why this is branded in me so deeply. And not that long ago, I went down into Vienna and went on up into the top of the steeple at St. Stephen's Cathedral, which stood in its current form at that day more than 300 years ago. And I got to ring the bell up there in the steeple with a little wooden smacker because they didn't want me to shake up everybody in Vienna. But I asked the Austrian historian, I had one of those little instincts, and it was, "What's this bell made out of?" I knew it was brass. "What's this bell made out of?" He said, "It's made from melted down Turkish cannons from the Battle of Vienna in 1683. Now you know that rings a clear sound all over that valley in Vienna, and that sends a message across history. But they weren't done. That's September 11th, 1683. They weren't done. 14 years later, they came back again and tried to cross the river at Zenta, which is now Serbia, and there was another huge battle and another glorious victory for, I think, the forces of that God had sent to save our culture and our civilization. And then, and by the way, I went there last November. I'm drawn to these places where history is turned, and they're sending me a horseshoe from one of the Turkish cavalry. It's on its way in a dip pouch from the embassy. I like those talismans like that too, that I can put my hand on and know, here's a piece of history. But we're not done with September 11th. We can go a little further, and that would be, now I'll tie in the Israeli history. 1948, Israel was formed. I was born in 1949. My history walks with Israel's history, the history of my life. And I recall I was graduated from high school in 1967. That's the 67 war. And then the 73 war, out of college, formative years of my life. And I picked up sometime after that the book written by James Michener, with the title of which I've forgotten, but he built the history of Israel through the characters that he put in his book. And I lived that history again vicariously because the age of the characters were matching with my age, and there I read about some of the great heroes of Israel. They forged freedom in the face of a kind of tyranny and almost hopeless odds. They forged that freedom much in the same way that the United States forged freedom. We're bonded because we're free people. We're bonded because we are God-loving and God-fearing, Bible-believing people. And the best friends that Israelis have and that the nation of Israel has are the conservative Christians in the United States, who are being bonded together by nights like tonight and messages like we're hearing in prayers like we have here tonight. And so the times that I've had the privilege to walk in the Holy Land, I'm ever more aware of how important that is and how moving it is to go to places like Capernaum and to stand there and look out onto the Sea of Galilee and think, this is where Jesus said to Peter, throw your nets on the other side, and have those nets come up full of fish, more than they can handle, for fear the nets would break. I've had the privilege of swimming in the Sea of Galilee and on the Jordan River where John the Baptist baptized Jesus, to go there, and the people that I toured with, they went on up into the gift shop to buy some mud for their makeup, and I thought, you're missing this. I went down to the river, and as I went out there alone and baptized myself in that river, because I wasn't going to pass up the chance to be baptized there in the waters that John the Baptist baptized Jesus in. And I gathered there, I took some of the empty water bottles, and I gathered water from the Jordan River, and it's in, the labels on those bottles are in Hebrew, and I brought them home with me. We didn't have any grandchildren at the time, but today Marilyn and I are blessed with 7 grandchildren, and every one of them has been baptized with Jordan River water that I drew from that place. This Holy Land is in our bones. It's in our Bible. It's in our bones. It's for a number of reasons. Because we love God. Because Jesus commands us to bond with Israel. It's in our bones because they are freedom-loving people, freedom-forging people. It's in our bones because they're our ally in that part of the Middle East. And it's a strategic interest as well for the United States. Now, I travel in and out of the Middle East. Once not that long ago, some months back, I left Lebanon and went to Libya because it was safer in Libya than it was in Lebanon. Can you imagine? It was about a year and a half or 2 years ago before the embassy fell, and it was a labyrinth of a fortification at that time. But in that part of the world, and dealing with the people who emerged there in leadership in that part of the world, and meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, we traveled and met with the leaders of each of those countries and helped shape a strategy. We can have a successful strategy over in that part of the world. It's not one that's going to be driven by Putin, and it's not one that backs away and suggests that somehow Israel should revert to its 1967 borders. That would be a national suicide to revert back to the indefensible 67 borders. It was a miracle of God for them to carve out the boundaries that they have today. And when you look at how small and narrow that country is, how difficult it is to defend, the people of Israel are only one strategic error away from being driven into the sea out of this deep hatred from all of their neighbors and something we don't understand here. And so in those meetings and discussions, I am hopeful that there is a strategic way to bring this all together. And we are at war with ISIS. They've declared war on us. We're at war with them. Iran thinks we're the great Satan. They have negotiated what I think is a really foolish deal on the nuclear. And that got set up in a convoluted way in Congress, and I could pick that apart, but I think you know. But I'll say this, that agreement was settled and negotiated and signed in sometime last July, and shortly after that I introduced House Resolution 500, which guarantees that it says that the House of Representatives supports Israel in their defense against Iran. And that's just a message from the House that we want to send. It's not the foreign policy from the President. It's not yet from the Senate, but it's a House Resolution 500. So I hope you take a look at that. And then, but strategically, in that part of the world, here's what gives me hope. Meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu in his little office, I had to wait for about 40 Chinese to come out of the main conference room before we could sit down there and meet, but to sit and talk about the strategy of this, to understand how that he has developed a relationship with Egypt and President El-Sisi in Egypt. And when I sit down with Sisi in Egypt, and he says to me, my relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel is stronger than my relationship with the United States and President Obama. That will get your attention. And he said that to me because he wanted me to bring that message back to the United States. When I go to Egypt, they say, why do you Americans support the Muslim Brotherhood? And I say, we don't support the Muslim Brotherhood. That's our president that went out to Al-Azhar University and gave his speech June 4th, 2009, and he seated the Muslim Brotherhood in the front row. I'm pointing over these empty seats now, guys. So he seated them in the front row. And everybody in Egypt knew what that was. And today they will tell you, the people that I trust in Egypt will say, this administration has severed 98% of the strings that tie the United States relationship with Egypt. But yet the relationship with Egypt and Israel is stronger than it is the United States and Egypt. We've got to restore those ties. When I look at President El-Sisi and he sits there and says, they, meaning the Islamists, want to impose Sharia law on the world. And he looked at me and put his head down almost between his knees and shook his head. He's rejecting the idea of forcefully pushing Sharia law out into the rest of the world. And he asked the most powerful rhetorical question that I can remember hearing, and that is it possible to accept the idea that the whole world must die so that Muslims can live? And of course, he rejects that concept, asks that rhetorical question so that I also bring that back to the United States. And I lay this out in this format so you can be thinking about what could happen if we can build the kind of alliance with a peaceful, moderate Muslim like President El-Sisi of Egypt, who, if you remember the history of Ataturk, bridged together the East and the West in a peaceful way in Turkey. That's going the other direction right now too. But if that could happen for the world, if Muslims could understand that we are peaceful people, Bible-believing, peaceful people, we don't want to have conflict with anybody, and if their religion commands them to try to kill us, then we'll have to go back to those conflicts again, like 732 at the Battle of Tours, or 1683, September 11th, 1683 in Vienna, or September 11th, 1697 in Zenta, which is now Serbia. Or let's think of another September 11th, 1972, when the Black September crew slaughtered 11 Israeli athletes on the 11th of September. September 11th means something to them. It means something to us now too. But what is important for us is to understand we have a culture and a civilization that's traceable back to Mosaic law. Moses got it right. He delivered us law. It flowed through Greece. It flowed through Rome, flowed through Western Europe. The birth of Christ put the gift of redemption on top of it all. And that gift that sat there in Western Europe was brought over here to the United States, I believe by the hand of God, on a continent that had unlimited natural resources for the purposes of living free with freedom to worship. And I believe that God moved our founding fathers around like men on a chessboard in order to shape this great country that we are part of. And the task of our founding fathers was to conceive of the idea of God-given liberty and transfer that into the culture and the civilization so they could believe in it enough that they were willing to fight for it and shape this nation that became the 13 original colonies. Well, how hard is it for us then? They did that, and we have to do what? Refurbish the pillars of American exceptionalism, strengthen Western civilization, Western Christendom, build bonds with like-minded, freedom-loving people around the world. And I am engaged in that, and we're planning an event that'll take someplace in Western Europe this late this summer, as we have it planned now, that ties together the foundation of the leaders within Western civilization that understand that our culture goes back to our faith. It goes back to Moses, and the people that believe in the Old Testament together are bound together. And those of us that are Old and New Testament have an obligation that's even greater. And so I'd ask you, understand this history. Think about it, read about it, pray about it, talk to others that think about it. And remember that we have this great gift in America. And it's not just good enough for us to circle our wagons here and defend that circle of wagons. We need to reach out. This is about mission. And we have a mission to restore the foundation of our civilization. We do that successfully, then we've also restored and strengthened the security and the foundation of Israel. And all of us could then one day walk in peace in the Holy Land. That's my prayer. Thank you all very much. God bless you all.